Well, welcome everyone on this gorgeous fall day to the October 8th, 2021 Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Catherine just posted the agenda in the chat as an overview. We will, the minutes are in there, and please let us know if you have any changes to those minutes. We'll get an update from the most recent Climate Council meeting from Jane, as well as anybody else from the group that would like to chime in on that. We'll do a review of the foundational criteria definitions from Marian. They've been updated, I believe, so we want to just make sure we're clarifying them for everybody. And then we will get into 1 through 5, going through each of the task groups to understand if folks have, just to get a status update on how prioritization is going, bring any actions that are in need of discussion at the subcommittee level back to this group, as well as just talking about any stumbling blocks that you may be confronting. Marian will also talk about the CAP drafting guidance, and Jane will give an update on the cross-cutting themes group, and then we'll have some public comment and adjourn. Any comments on the agenda or changes to the minutes that folks would like to see? Hey, Catherine, what's up? You have any updates?
Nope. I have no additional updates, except as always, thank you to everybody for everything you're doing in between our meetings.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
Let's roll right into our update on the October 7th Climate Council meeting. Jane, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Happy Friday afternoon. So the Climate Council is moving sort of full steam ahead, and I think Tuesday's meeting was a good example of sort of the challenges ahead of like consumption of information in a short timeline. And so on Tuesday's agenda, we looked a bit more closely, although at a high level for the council, not at the depth that some of the subcommittees have seen, to the analysis that's happened in order to understand how the actions that are being proposed specifically from cross-sector, but then also the ones in your subcommittee as well as Ag and Eco related to agriculture will all add up to meet the cumulative emissions reductions. We had some good questions and back and forth around that presentation and the impacts of agriculture in that space. And I'll just say that we're having some follow-up conversation on Tuesday morning next week with a more cross-cutting group to look specifically at how the LEAP modeling does or doesn't account for the components of agriculture to ensure we're getting it right, and that the components of the actions are all added up in the data. And then we actually dove deep into cross-sector mitigation actions, similarly to how we looked at your actions the week before. Cross-sector presented them by sector, recognizing transportation and buildings are the largest components of that work, but also leaving time to speak about electricity actions and how they'll help support electrification and reduction of emissions in other sectors. And then non-energy, we didn't have time for, so that's going to be on the agenda for next week for the Climate Council. The Climate Council is now meeting, if you haven't seen your invite, weekly between now and December 1st. And that 1 week that we didn't have a meeting left, October 19th, has now been scheduled, largely because of some challenges this week around our public engagement and needing to kick that presentation of public engagement out a week rather than it coming up on this Tuesday's agenda. And so in addition, I think we started to highlight some of the substantive actions at the council level that there potentially could be disagreement on in the emissions reduction space. Specifically, conversations sort of started to unravel around TCI, which is the top action initiative coming out of the transportation sector work. There are a lot of questions about how it speaks specifically or not to emissions reductions in Vermont and what the modeling shows around that, and then choices we make about market strategies and elevating those actions. And so we're starting to think about how we will do better and think about how we prep and prepare council members to speak thoughtfully and knowledgeably on some of these really challenging issues that are going to have to reach agreement on at the council. So I think that's all I really have about the council meeting. Oh, and I should have said, I'm sorry, that the meeting was kicked off by Kaya Morris, who did a nice job of sort of walking through outline of expectations and the equity work that she'll be doing with all of you, which seemed to be a really nice way to kick off the meeting, and we'll continue to lean into some of those equity questions at the beginning of the council meeting as we march to December 1st. So that's all I have from the council meeting, but happy to answer any questions that people have about it.
Thanks, Jane. Any
commentary on if anybody else or any other counselors were on the meeting, just any commentary on where you felt like some of the conversation on Tuesday intersects with our work?
One quick question.
Yeah, go.
Jane, one of the presentations on some of the emissions targets, I'd asked about the VMT stuff for compact settlement, and the consultant said you had some preliminary information, but do you have anything that you can share? Because it'd be really helpful to us in kind of, playing this little game of ranking these things. Emissions is a factor of it, and I kind of hoping we'd have some information to at least inform our prioritization.
Yeah, I saw your email about that, Chris, and sorry that I just haven't gotten to it yet. But there, the way that my understanding of what was done with VMT, and you all should, Marion and Chris, who were in some of those initial meetings around this, is there was a lit review done to more accurately reflect the benefits of VMT reductions across the pathway of transportation and some of the ideas that were being put forward. But that was the only analysis that was done, was this lit review to use a better number around VMT reductions in the LEAP modeling. I don't really know if David was suggesting that I have something. I don't have anything on that yet. I went through with the LEAP modeling this week with David Hill and Liz Hansen after the council meeting the next day, and started to think about when we're going to get the final report. But there's more specifics on the transportation components built into that, but I don't have any reporting from them yet on any of that work. So I don't have anything on VMT specifically.
Okay, well, just obviously we're running out of time, and that information, would be helpful to both drafting and our prioritization. So I don't know when we can get it.
I'm not quite sure what you're expecting though, because I don't think we have anything specific for VMT. We made a choice that we didn't do anything specific.
Right, but
is
is
LEAP that informed the LEAP modeling?
But the LEAP model is going to plug in a number that's going to show the different, dispersed settlement is this number, compact settlement is this number, was my understanding.
I don't actually, yeah. I don't think the LEAP modeling is not specific by action. It is at a pathway level. And so right now, I've only worked to set up the meeting, and this, I'm sorry to take everybody's time with this, but this is really important. And Chris, I appreciate you holding me to the fire on this.
I'm not sure you do.
I do. I do. It's just right now the LEAP modeling, I have, I'm going to pull up while we move on also, that I have a memo on the changes that were made to the LEAP model from the original model that was developed for the Public Service Department, and the updates that were made for the CAP mitigation pathway, which should reflect any changes that were made to VMT that were used in the original model for the Public Service Department. So I'm going to pull that up while we're talking and just look at what the specifics of that memo says. That was a deliverable from ESG and CADMIS at the end of September. And so I'll look at that. There's also a next step of setting up specific sector meetings, and that's the one I was speaking to around ag and non-energy that's happening on Tuesday, and I haven't set up the other sectoral meetings, and it probably would be great for you and or Bronwyn to join that one again, just around transportation again, so that you can ask those questions to people who are more knowledgeable about that than I, and then also just make sure that if we're not getting what we need for this plan, how we continue to advance the idea of the study that we all know that we would like to have around VMT and the benefits of land use on reducing vehicle miles traveled.
Well, thank you for that update.
Any other thoughts or
should say-
comments on the, oh, go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say at the council meeting, we also talked about the criteria definitions, and I failed to mention that now, but as we talk about updates to the criteria and the definitions, we can talk about the comments that were made at the council.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jane. Any other thoughts on the council meeting on Tuesday? Chris?
I heard Chris Camp and he said we need more meetings and longer meetings. Awesome, dude.
Well, I mean, one of the concerns I had is, it's like, well, let's resolve transportation issues in 20 minutes. Let's tighten this up. We gotta, just gotta reorient all that, and we'll figure this out. And I'm just concerned. I've asked the steering committee to deliberate on this a bit. I'm just concerned that we haven't left enough room for actual engagement, debate, negotiation, that kind of thing on the policies that are going to be coming out of these subcommittees. But what I was going to bring up, and bear with me for a second, I'll get to how this relates to resilience, is Cadmus had presented some information about basically how the reduction in the size of the dairy herd and the benefits of reducing methane from them. But this gets to land use and I would say argue land conversion and what that implies for runoff, stormwater management, that kind of thing. As we think about changes in agriculture, typically what happens is that land gets converted to residential, large lot residential subdivisions. It's not, I've worked in several different states now on conversion from like commodity ag to smaller scale ag. And in Vermont, we're talking thousands of acres. And you're not going to convert that all to beets and chard and apples. So, the typical conversion in the Northeast is to housing. Even in states that are having declining populations, you tend to see subdivisions come out of those farms. So some of this stuff that we're talking about, we just need to make sure that we really parse, like what does that look like? I'm going to write something up and see if science and data can perhaps help pull some information about conversion rates in Vermont and elsewhere. But these are some things we're going to need to look at.
Thanks, Chris. What do we, if we can move into our review of foundational criteria definitions with Marion to go over some of the updates. And Anne does have a comment in the chat about that, Marion.
Yep. And I'm actually going to toss that hot potato over to Jane. So Jane and I both did, but Jane did a lot more work on this, so she'll be able to speak to it more clearly. The changes that we made to the foundational criteria definitions, incorporating both comments that we've heard at subcommittee meetings or that subcommittee members provided to us, and also the comments received at the council meeting. Jane, do you want to pull it up and share it, or do you want me to do that and you can walk through it, whatever's easiest? I think Jane's going to share it.
Sorry, yes, I had too many windows open. Okay, so thank you. And so the definitions rolled out to the subcommittees, including you all last week, and people had the opportunity to share comments on the criteria ahead of the council meeting. Most of those comments from subcommittees members before they went in for review in front of the council were really related to equity and the recognition that while the scoring rubric was the tool to really evaluate and review equity, that because that was going to come after this initial stepwise approach to prioritization would have occurred, that we wanted to be a little bit more explicit around equitable considerations in these definitions as well. So we brought in equity into the definition around cost effectiveness in the calling it out explicitly around considerations when we're thinking about social cost of carbon and other impacts further down the road outside of the actual costs now. And then we also spoke to it explicitly as a consideration to be thinking about as we were reviewing co-benefits of specific actions. So those were the relatively minor changes that we made going into the council meeting. I can't remember any other specific one. We only had 3 or 4 comments. And then at the council meeting itself, one of your co-chairs made some comments, Erica, that I've tried to take into account, as well as some other comments that came up largely around, and I will say in further refinement, actually working with cross-sector yesterday who had actually already used prioritization extensively, as I know you have too, in reviewing and ranking all of their actions. We made some more real-time adjustments to it also to be reflective of issues around enabling actions, which don't rank highly in and of itself through this prioritization. And also, I want to say, backed off the idea that only high priority actions move into the body of the climate action plan. We also spoke to, before we were saying some medium priority actions that make overall prioritization could reach consensus with your subcommittee. Now we're saying like any medium or low that a particular person or group wants to bring to conversation for the full subcommittee. There could be specific reasons why a medium or low overall priority action is still something that we would want to act on now, and that will just be beholden on the subcommittee to speak to that and explain why it's moving forward. So in the impact definition, especially for cross-sector, you'll see this added language around high impact will also speak to enabling actions that are needed to advance actions that are high impact as defined here, and it speaks to for the highest possible enabling actions that it's the only pathway to advancing that action. So this really comes into play when we're thinking about electrification. I'll just say for all of you, electrification and supporting a resilient grid and grid optimization, like that is not a high priority greenhouse gas reduction, because we've seen so much greenhouse gas reduction already in that sector. And so but the fact of the matter is, in order to realize really impactful greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the transportation sector and buildings, we have to have a strong and resilient grid and also have to have clean electricity there. So we were really trying to think about electrification in that case. I wanted to put that forward because I did not carry forward the same kind of thinking for enabling actions into resilience, adaptation, and sequestration. And so when we revisit that, you might find that those kinds of actions aren't carrying forward. And if that's the case, we can think about how to speak to enabling actions in the space also. In impact, there was a comment around also being explicit about working lands, adding in working lands after natural environment. We did that. That was a comment at the council level. There was also a comment about if impact, especially for ag and eco and rural resilience, is the definition that we're carrying forward into cost effectiveness, and we're trying to be explicit about cost of inaction, that we should spell that out in the definitions for ag and eco and rural resilience. So I added what I struggled with and Marion reviewed, and in the end we agreed was the best we could do here in trying to represent it, but I also would take comments on this, was adapt to or build resilience to climate change impacts, and by doing so, avoid costly actions from a future event. And there's sort of moderated language throughout trying to speak to paying now, having an impact now will save us costs later. And that carries forward then into the cost effectiveness definitions down below. I did not make any changes to cost effectiveness, and I just want to say that because I know that there is some concern from folks in the council and probably maybe for some of you as well, that cost effectiveness has something contributed to it around new funding, making it seem less cost effective. And it's simply a recognition that then as we pull into the overall prioritization, that you're not going to want to advance a low impact action that needs a new funding source. And so you'll see in the overall prioritization, I think it carries forward and works out okay, that even though we're tying new funding sources to cost effectiveness, we're allowing high impact, low cost effectiveness, even though to move forward. And I think because of the narrative approach that you can take in your overall prioritization, hopefully you can speak to that and make the case, and it doesn't, anyway, it's the way we've decided to do it. I think that your highest priority and highest impact action still will carry weight and move forward. And it's just an appreciation that new funding sources are challenging in Vermont for long-term funding. And that's really the only one that's a low in that space, is where we need a new funding source for indefinitely over more than 10 years.
So Jane,
Yep.
reading this definition, it appears to me it would be possible to both need a new funding source and have a net cost that is close to or at zero. Would you agree with that?
I'm trying to think of an example. My head works most with examples.
I'm
So
trying to think of one too, but
moderate will be defined as an ongoing.
it could have a low, let's say it could have a low net cost when you consider the avoidance costs, the public benefit dollars, and all the full net cost of an action could, when taking into account the full universe of the savings, could have a low net cost, but still need a new funding source because of who bears the cost and who achieves the benefits.
Yeah, so the way we have this right now, and I'm looking at the overall ranking, but yeah, I appreciate that. But so if you have something that's highly impactful and has a moderate, low, still ranks out as a highly cost effective. And then below that, you can have something that's very highly impactful, significant based on cost, which would mean it needs a new funding source and is a medium priority, which sort of speaks to the actual overall benefit as being, it's not totally equal to net cost, but you can see how the relationship between impact and like new funding source still makes that action a medium priority and a medium cost effectiveness. I'm not sure if I'm explaining it exactly clear, but cost effectiveness, because it's a relationship between impact and funding source, it's still coming out as medium cost effectiveness overall, which gets to that lifetime net cost maybe.
But it's not, yeah, I guess I struggle with that because when you have actions where the costs and the benefits are borne by different people, when you add in needing a new funding source, it could skew that. And I'm sorry, Mike, I jumped in. It looked like you were going to say something.
No, I was just, and maybe you hit this earlier, but when we're saying new funding source, is it a temporary funding source or a permanent? Because that would make a difference too, right?
Yeah, so we have that second denominator, the denominator there on the equation as being, if it's a short-term, single-time need of a funding source, then it's different than if it's a long-term, more than 10-year need of a new funding source.
So it's really more probably people resources that are the long-term versus the built world. Just wrapping my head around this.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy if anybody has an example to get, and maybe Marion can relate better to what Catherine's trying to say. Happy to
Investments
hear it,
in public transit.
think of that.
is an example I can think
There's
of.
like an initial upfront cost of buying the public transit, and then the
Or
fact that
even an
overall they pay
ongoing,
cost because you're
or even an ongoing cost of expanding a route.
To run a train, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Mhm.
It could need a new ongoing funding source. But the public benefit, those achieved by the general public by the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or by the personal financial savings could outweigh the investment. But it would still need new
But
funding.
doesn't that speak to the impact?
Yeah, and I think that's where, if you look at the 3 lines there with the sort of numerator and denominator, that's where I think of if the impact to the general public or the long-term cost savings to the general public, both from the cost perspective, but also from an equity perspective, which is built into that impact definition, it would come out as a high impact action. So you'll see, like the numerator for a number of those on the first 2 lines is high, and then say that you still have it's a significant upfront cost, which means, is that long-term funding source for both to pay for the building of the new train and then the maintenance for it in the long term, which would be the denominator, which is significant. Overall, that would come out to a medium cost-effective item because we're weighting the impact of that particular action, the benefit to the public, benefit for equity purposes, with the actual cost of that, either identifying a new funding source or the long-term costs. And it still comes out as a medium and overall medium cost effective, which as a subcommittee, you all will have the jurisdiction to move that and have that be in the body of the cap.
Well,
so
that's
I think
only
it does
just
address.
one. It's not an overall prioritization. It's just one component, and
Right,
you
it's
still
one
have.
component. Yeah.
So it still might be a high priority item, period, because it's
Yeah.
just one component.
I think it does address what you're bringing up, Catherine, but
Mhm.
but I guess we could talk through it further if it needs to be clarified also in the definition. And I do see maybe Bronwyn.
Yeah, Bronwyn has
Hands
had
up.
Oh, I was off mute. Hi, I went to go turn myself off mute. I think one of the things that would be really helpful, I appreciate how difficult it is to come up with criteria and a system for doing this. I think one of the things that I am concerned about in how this is presented, my biggest concern is that there will be an assumption that the criteria for ranking mitigation actions is the same as ranking resilience. And so I think it's going to be really important to point out that the cost effectiveness has been done very differently for mitigation than it has for resiliency. And so that the ultimate rankings are not comparable. And so nobody should be looking at this climate action report and thinking that a high mitigation action is the same or different than a high or medium or low resilience action, because the methodologies are just fundamentally different. So I can appreciate that it's a challenging thing to do, and we may not have a whole lot of opportunity or time to come up with a better system or change the system. But as long as that is, ultimately, it would be good if that's flagged in the climate action plan to say, these are not the same. A high mitigation prioritization is not the same as a high or medium or low or whatever resiliency action, and make that really clear to whoever is reading it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have done that a bit, and we could probably do it more strongly. But I also, to be honest, think it's to the advantage of, not to the advantage, but I don't think it's to the detriment of either one of the actions to have different criteria or have a different overall ranking. They're not being compared necessarily against each other. So yes, I think we can note that clearly, and there's a whole chapter essentially in the climate action plan that's out there for review right now for this coming council meeting that explains the application of the foundational criteria in prioritization. And so if there's a component of just speaking clearly at the bottom, actually in the overall prioritization summary, that as you accrue the benefits from the individual definitions and create an overall prioritization, that there were different definitions used to roll those up for the different components of the work. And I do just want to say, I'm happy to think about how to clarify any of this, but I do think that at this point, these have been essentially approved by the council, and that there's just a very tight timeline, and that we need to start to move forward with using them. And I know you guys have, and I'm looking forward to learning from what you were able to do with that process, but that's, and I'm sure it can be approved upon. I don't have any allusion to the fact that this probably could be done a lot better, but I think that there is pretty good merit to most of these, to at least as a basis for this work.
And I think really the point like that Bronwyn was bringing up, and my question related to cost is just understanding that there are limitations to any tool that you use, no matter how perfect you strive to get it and how much time you have to develop it. And so understanding those limitations and making sure we account for those in our work is just the important part, I think.
Yeah. And I hope that, that has to also get to the flexibility that we're trying to give around like the recognition that you all are the experts here, and that's why your subcommittee was formed. And so when there's the prioritization is shaking out to have some of your actions be medium or low, but you inherently understand their importance and can speak to why they're not shaking out as high in the prioritizations and the shortcomings there, that would be really beneficial too, to carry those forward and also clarify. I do not have any other changes that were made based on the council meeting. And Erica, I think that there was one comment that you made in particular at the council meeting around the challenge of some low cost effective, around the only way for a low cost effective cumulative ranking to emerge as a medium or high ultimately would be this high impact component. So if it's low, it's not cost effective, and it's not a high impact, you won't be able to carry it into a medium priority and therefore into the overall prioritization. But we felt strongly that that was important to leave it as in the overall prioritization as a medium there, but also because we gave the discretion around the subcommittee lifting up low priority actions and being able to clarify why they came out low, but why they're still important, I think hopefully speaks to and will allow actions that aren't coming out as cost effective because of the shortcomings of the definition to still be able to carry forward.
Okay, thank you. That appreciate you guys hearing me out on that. Does anybody have any final comments before we move into talking through our pathways? Okay, thanks Jane and Marion for that. Let's move into our pathways. So again, we are looking to hear from the task groups for each pathway to talk through any of the actions that are giving you stumbling blocks or that may need to be clarified so that they can have better prioritization rankings and notes that support those rankings. Any actions that you would like to raise for discussion with this group at the subcommittee level before you before you complete your ranking, or just any general comments on the status of where you're at. And that actually should be the information up front where you're at with prioritization. So we'll start with pathway 1, which was Chris and Bronwyn and myself. Chris or Bronwyn, do you want to take it away and I can add in some items? Chris, you're on mute.
I'm better that way, usually quiet and muted. I think we can be really quick about it. We can do pathway 1, 4, and 5 and just talk about our general observations. We did convene our subcommittee or our task groups, and we did some preliminary rankings on these. Since there are so many tasks, we agreed to just kind of work individually. We're working from the same spreadsheet to score things just for efficiency purposes. We just don't have a lot of time. And then we're rechecking in next Monday to hopefully compare each other's work, make sure we're kind of using the same yardstick and finding agreement on kind of what our higher priority items are. We aim to have these close to final by midweek next week. And I don't know if it's on the agenda to share them. If I suspect there's going to be some discussions that we're going to elevate up for just, right track, wrong track. Hey, we don't know what to do about these. So we'd appreciate some people's input on that. As far as like challenges with the scoring rubric itself, it's a little subjective. I'm Brahman. I don't know. I'm going to let you add to the details. I don't know how much you really want to know, but I'll give you the talking stick. Thanks.
I apologize. I think you guys got started on some of that conversation and my screen went black. So I think we already talked about at least some of the challenges that we're noticing in the criteria, which is, any kind of tool is never going to be perfect for every application. We're doing our best to work through putting some language in for each of the criteria and keeping it fairly consistent across the different actions and the different pathways. And yeah, as Chris mentioned, I think we're hoping to have that all done at the beginning of next week, and then we can move into the other parts of that matrix, the equity screening, and then some of the implementation pieces. So who is the implementer, what's the time frame, et cetera. I'm happy, as with anything, as you go through the tool, that's when you start to realize where some of these things don't necessarily work or match up. So I'm happy to share some of my observations that I've come up with, if that's helpful in making sure that this group as a whole can apply the criteria in a relatively consistent way for all of our pathways, as opposed to pathway 1, 4, and 5 all having a pretty consistent application of that, while pathway 2 and 3 may have a different interpretation of how to use those criteria. So just offering up that I'm happy to share the observations that I've noticed about where there's some challenges in using the criteria and how to think of them and just get the work done.
Hey, Bronwyn, do you have any that you want to raise up to the subcommittee level right now in 1, 4, or 5 that, or Chris, that should be just discussed for a couple of minutes? I have several that we walked through that I have proposed rewording so that they're more outcome oriented in my comments. And so we can talk through that on Monday, but I think we're going to have to, task groups are going to have to be given a little bit of license to do that rewording, because some of these, the way they're written, you can't prioritize them without being really clear about the outcome. And so it's really important as you're walking through the prioritization is that if you need to reword it and you're capturing the essence of the action, but you're making sure that the outcome is apparent when you're looking and the action can stand on its own, I think that's going to be all the better for all of us.
That's a great point that you bring up, Erica. And I see Anne nodding her head a lot. I know we received some feedback from the Conservation Law Foundation, and there's been feedback we've received from counselors, as well as through the general public outreach events. So I think it's an excellent point that these task groups should be given the leeway to make adjustments to actions as needed to reflect the comments that we've gotten through all those venues, and incorporate that into the presentation of the priorities at next week's meeting. Is there anybody that has a concern about moving forward in that way and allowing the task groups to do that? All right, be empowered.
Yeah. Just a point of clarity too. There were some actions in ours that we hadn't seen before. There was a lot of shuffling toward the end. A lot of things got moved back and forth, and there's a lot of kind of redundancies, and there's some actions that aren't really actions. So we'd like some latitude to be able to hoover those up. We'll keep a record of that, but there's some things that just we've got 3 of the same things, or something that just, where did this come from? And we just don't know, the trail of how it got to where it was. So we were probably going to do that cleanup as well.
Especially where there's duplicative ones, where you get like 3 that kind of say the same thing, like consolidate those babies and make sure that you get all the points.
No, if you say it 3 times, it's more important.
That's right. Dave,
So-
go ahead.
Yeah, I like the idea of empowering the task groups, but do we need to document when they make a change like that?
That's our intent.
At the
Well,
bottom, I think.
Yeah, and I think Dale did some of that work of consolidation for us in the comments from CLF. Whether you agree with the final suggested wording or not, it
Mhm.
was great to highlight those places where we do have overlap.
So Chris and Bronwyn, I just have a couple that I wanted to raise just to flag for the subcommittee. And one is around pathway 4. I gotta get to it here. I highlighted it. It's on pathway 4. Well, I'll go to the end. Strategy 5, which is, and I think these came actually from Conservation Law Foundation, talking about shifting our policy stance to a net gain of wetlands policy, especially as it relates to the permitting process. I speak so eloquently about this that you can tell how well able I am to rank it. I'm probably going to try and enlist the help of Jens in a couple of those, since you're one of our folks. I am not able to speak or think in
Yeah.
that way related to wetlands policy.
Well, Bronwyn, I don't know what you think. I mean, we still have a lot of pathway 4 items that ag and eco need to weigh in on. And I would,
It's not those, Chris. It's the
Okay.
ones at the very bottom of pathway 4. There's like 3 of them that are highlighted in blue that it's basically stronger mitigation requirements for individual wetland permits to require restoration of substantial predetermined ratio. It's above my head.
okay.
But I don't think it's above Jens's head, and I think he could probably help us on that.
Sure.
There's one other, and this is probably we'll probably discuss this a little bit more as a group next week. But as it relates to building codes, we've got a couple of different actions in there about building codes, and I think Chris and Bronwyn and I can kind of come together and discuss what the consolidated building code action should be. One is stronger than the other. One is considering developing building codes that are climate resilient building codes so that we can be more competitive for programs like FEMA's BRIC program. There's also another one that I believe came from ACCD about developing sample building codes. And so I just raised that just to get a temperature check from the subcommittee about folks feeling around building codes, residential building codes, commercial building codes, and whether we need to just if we can consolidate what the general consensus is, we can go back and make sure that what the action is reflects the overall direction of this group.
Well, and to complicate matters, cross sector is also recommending building codes too. So,
we come at this from a resilience standpoint too.
Right.
So
I guess my point is, if there's a building code, there's an energy aspect to it, there's a safety aspect to it, and there's
this came up in some feedback from the parallel process of the climate act or the comprehensive energy plan as well. I can see, and sorry, Chris, if I'm speaking out of turn, I can see the value in adding an action that says we should explore resilient building codes. I think the action would have to be, at this point, there needs to be some analysis around that. I think particularly in relation to how it's applied. I mean, it's no small task to draft new building codes. So I think the action can be that we get some support, hire a consultant, go through a process to decide and develop what would what would an update to building codes be if we wanted an updated code to make buildings more resilient. But to Chris's point, that I think would have to dovetail with whatever recommendation is coming out of the cross-sector committee around building codes as well, because there's no point in making up resilient building codes if you're not also considering the other objectives around mitigating emissions from, let's say, energy use in buildings.
So it sounds like Bronwyn's advocating for the rather than coming out and saying adopt building codes, to have a process for examining whether that is appropriate, and if so, what that would look like. Chris, were you planning on commenting on that question Erica has raised as well? And Pat, I'm assuming yours is a different
different
comment. Okay, all right, so we'll jump to Chris and remind others who aren't official members of the subcommittee that you can feel free to jump in and not need to wait for public comment period.
So having overseen inspections and permits, buildings, of course, are systems, right? So if you want to create a more resilient building, you need codes that actually establish the standards for everything from the grading of the lot, including sediment erosion control, while you're constructing the building, all the way to structural, electrical, plumbing, and gas. All of that ultimately leads up to the energy efficiency code, because if you have a leaky building, a wet building, if the structure is not right, then you're basically sealing up a building that's potentially dangerous. And the issue for the state, frankly, is how do you administer it? It's frankly quite easy to adopt a code. You adopt international codes and then you amend those to your local standards. It's not rocket science. What would be a challenge for the state is figuring out it's administered at a state level, or I think it would have to be, and exactly what that would look like. The study is fine, but I would just, and FEMA's done research that shows where you have building codes in place, you wind up with more resilient structures. And I forget if it was Brookings or who it was. There've been other research on it too, if you need the data on it. But I would encourage you to go with as strong a language as possible, recommending it, because the other issue too is just how much carbon is in the structures that are getting built. And if ultimately homes are basically going to have to be kind of gradually rebuilt over time because they weren't built right in the first place, you're going to lose some of that. You may ultimately increase the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that over time as well. So.
Thanks, Chris. Any other thoughts related to building codes and that we can take back? Okay.
This is Ben. I just want to say that siting considerations can be incorporated into building codes. Where structures get built, both in a community relative to flood risk and even on a property with respect to the length of new driveway required and solar orientation, can be captured in building codes.
Thanks, Ben. Pat?
Just a specific and then a general. So the specific, there are a few of the things I see on pathway 4, which I have probably a slightly older spreadsheet around wetlands, that the Ag and Ecosystem group have talked extensively about the interaction between conservation practices between ag, forest, and wetlands. So I think maybe the wetlands cross-cutting group needs to just consider those. I think a number of these are additive, but there might be a few that may need discussion. But Jane, it leads to the other process question. When are subcommittees supposed to forward other subcommittees stuff that they think isn't really in their bailiwick? Like, I know the Ag and Eco has several more building and built environment things they want to make sure you're covering. You probably are, but we just need to know when to get them to you.
I mean,
Last month.
We can take them. We can take them. Based on what I saw in the spreadsheet, in the Ag and Eco spreadsheet, I think there's a lot of duplication. I think it's the same sentiment. So we can take them and just be sure that they're consistent. And where there's inconsistencies, we can try and work that out. But like, I think to try and rank them alongside everything else is just too late. We don't have the time to rank all of the ones, and they don't have the time to rank all of ours. But we're probably, I mean, just again, looking at through them, there's a lot of duplication there because we were all thinking the same thing.
And I think that I would agree with that, that you just said, Erica, and it seems like the most important part is going to be reconciling the high priority items that are in the actual main body of the climate action plan. It's okay if there's redundancy and slight inconsistency among the actions that aren't high priorities. So that's to me where we can focus our effort and our time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Marian, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I want to jump in because I think Jane and I were trying to figure this out as it was being discussed at Ag and Eco. And I think we've tried a couple of different solutions for, encouraging subcommittees to share between, or, whether to do that with the cross-cutting themes group. I think at this point, you're right. It's a little too late to try and share those actions and actually have them incorporated. And I think to Erica's point, a lot of them are duplicative or are covering the same area. That being said, and I don't have the details on this, but like Abby in Ag and Eco this morning mentioned something about food systems and wanting to send that to rural resilience. And I don't think we have anything on food systems. So I think there are going to be a lot that are duplicative, and we can look at those, especially as they come out in terms of ranking, or if there's if they send some that are really similar to ones that rural resilience already has and how those have ranked, and whether we need to have a discussion around those, or whether they're fine to just sit as they are. But I think, yeah, we do need to think a little bit about if other subcommittees are trying to send whole topics to other subcommittees, what to do with those, because it's too late to try and incorporate those. But if they're not covered in any subcommittee, how do we speak to that in the body of the plan?
Right.
So Jade and I have talked about some ways to do that. Likely trying to talk with the cross-cutting themes group to ensure that we at least have a representative from each subcommittee who's aware of the process. And then whether that just means we have it all on a sheet and we can say, yes, these are topics that are covered, or no, these are not topics that are covered, and here's why. But I agree. I mean, it's all a question of timing at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's a large gap, if we've seen a large gap, then we're going to have to figure out how to address it. But we have all we can just to address everything that we have in here. So,
and I have been kind of keeping tabs in an informal way of the ag and ecosystems work, just to make sure that we're not ending up at major cross purposes. And I don't think that we are. And one of the reasons why we don't have food systems in ours is because we were rest assured that ag and ecosystems was taking care of it. So we thought, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that. It's on their list.
Yeah, I'm interested. Is there, in terms of food systems, what is it that is the nexus to rural resilience and adaptation that needs our expertise that they are not able to address with their expertise?
I don't know. I can't speak to that.
I thought the broader thing they were talking about this morning of the package of actions they wanted to share was around wastewater, stormwater, and the stuff Lauren was speaking to.
Yeah, Abby did mention something about food systems, though.
Yeah, I think for the ease, I think you all have identified what's practically doable. So I think on food systems, Ag's got it. They can keep it for now, for better, for worse, unless they can have some incredible clear nexus for you all. I think on a few other things that are much more related to the built environment, I'll forward them to the co-chairs, Catherine and Erica, and you guys can decide what, if anything, to do with them at this point. And I'll pull them out of that matrix today and get them to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and from our matrix, it may have been that the ones that I had just been speaking about, the ones that I opened up with to elevate, we may actually want to send them to them because they may be, I think they're probably redundant to what they're looking at. The strategy under pathway 4, all of the actions under strategy 1 related to supporting forest pattern to reinforce compact settlements and strategically protect infrastructure, they're highlighted as ag and eco. They're likely redundant to what they're saying too, because So we can send those over. If they're going to give some to us, we got to give some.
So we're going to send them things, so we don't want anything back.
It's only a one-way street.
Okay, any other topics for conversation from Chris or Bronwyn? I mean, under those pathways that we were just discussing.
I mean, just to emphasize the point, we're kind of out of time, you know, and so long as our high priority stuff is in agreement, I think that's where we are.
Yeah. Okie dokie. So we covered, it was 1, 3, and 4, right? Or 1, 3, and 5.
1, 3, and 5. Yes.
Let's go to 2. Pathway 2.
1, 4,
Yes.
and 5.
Yes, 1, 4, and 5. That's right.
You're muted, Ann.
So
Anne's
I can-
pathway 3. Pathway Joe is lead for pathway 2, but he's not here, so someone else will have to jump in.
Yep, I can start. So we actually had a few people missing this week, so we weren't able to get anything on the calendar to actually meet. We did start emailing today I actually took a shot at filling out the first round of the ranking. And so that we'll have something to discuss next week when we actually do sit down. We have 3 times next week that we can hopefully put together on all of our calendars. I think it works for everyone. Chris, I think you're the only one that I don't know if those times work for, but I'll send the invites out and hopefully we can make it work. So we haven't started. Anne has actually responded with some feedback. So we've got it started. We've just got to actually get together and finish it next week, which I don't think will be a problem. And to Chris's point on getting agreement on the high priorities, I think we can get there pretty easily. And I thought Dale's feedback was pretty helpful today too from the CLF. So I don't know if you would add anything, Chris, there. The other 3 aren't here today. So
Yeah, no. Just a point on Dale, just for transparency, we have a meeting set up with her. I want to say Monday, if anybody wants to join us, just to talk through her letter.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay. And then pathway 3.
Hi, everybody. We made some good progress last week, thanks to Marion. We had 1 meeting and we got through 2 action items in that 1 meeting, but I think it really set up a good framework. So thank you for your help, Marion. And so the 3 of us are working in a Google Doc, which I think is a great system. And so far, I think Dave is our champ. It sort of feels like a race running down through the list of action items. And we have another meeting on Wednesday, and I think we'll, try to resolve, we'll compile, and hopefully we'll all have entered our stuff before Wednesday, and then we can compile and discuss. So I think we're doing as well as we could be doing. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ann. I would add also thanks to Marion for modifying a spreadsheet that allows each of our group to reply individually, which will merge in the end. So we're all meeting for breakfast next Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, and hopefully we'll get things wrapped up. One thing I have noted is, as I go through the actions, is there's still a lot of duplicate actions within our pathway, especially around things like weatherization. So we'll probably need to think about condensing that at some point. So, or probably next Wednesday. So.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of my observations. I think, as Anne said, we made it through 2 actions, but ended up consolidating those into 1 action. And so that's, I think, to what Dave's getting at too. There is a lot of duplication, and a little more just for Dave and Anne, but I did a little more thinking on that first action, because it's related to gathering data for buildings, vehicle fleets, businesses on energy usage. And sort of, I do think it's just raising, I think, as someone else has said, that we really need to think about the outcome of the action and have it be more specific when we're doing those rankings. And so thinking about, what data sets we actually need, what already exists, and where we need to gather that and fill those gaps, I think will help us to refine that a bit further. And I've talked with Jane about this, and I think Jane's not at her computer, but something for the group to think about. As Jane was going through the changes to the foundational criteria definitions, she noted that, at least for now, did not add anything into the definitions for impact for rural resilience and ag and eco, where sort of a enabling action that maybe is ranked as a low could be a medium or a high if it's sort of helping you achieve a high priority action that fits under that main definition. And for the one that we spent some time working through as pathway 3, initially it was coming out as a low overall ranking. And we sort of thought because gathering data doesn't necessarily have a lot of co-benefits and didn't have a lot of immediate impact to get it to a medium or a high. So I do think it was sort of thinking about how do we frame up those actions where, we need data to make a lot of the changes for energy efficiency in our rural communities. But for those types of actions where it's more enabling or sort of helping other actions move forward, how do we capture those in the overall prioritization and process? So just something that I think is coming up, and perhaps the sort of ability of the subcommittee to just take low or medium overall actions and sort of move them up into the body of the cap will be sufficient for that. But I am curious if anyone else is running into that yet.
That seems like a great point, Marion, that being able to raise those up and even using the justification that's in the definition for the other criteria will be a reason to explain why that is the case.
Yeah, this has been along similar lines. We run into this all the time with FEMA, where we know that a mitigation project is a great project, and we know there's a lot of data that is going to be needed to get FEMA to say yes to the benefit cost analysis ratio being positive in the end. So we phase the project. And it seems like in the high, medium, low matrix, we need a way of recognizing where a project is a phase 1 or foundational to build a case for a larger action. That's sort of a special category of where we'll never get where we're trying to go unless we do the data gathering phase.
Yeah, great point. So I think that's, again, what Jane was getting at with the changes to those for cross sector. And that I think is something that may need to be applied. I was just, as we were using the enabling actions terminology, I didn't want us to, I know we've talked about enabling actions, especially when speaking about land use. And I think our application of that for cross sector is a little bit different in using that as a term. So we'll just have to think about how that's defined in those definitions.
Can I ask a quick related question?
Yeah.
Do you guys have among your actions improved data collection at the local level for repetitive damage?
Yeah.
VM people shaking their heads, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll double check that, but.
I believe there is something in there around data collection and mapping of sites that have been, locations of repetitive damage.
Eric, I guess hopefully it'll capture the need to like the non-declared events, right? It's just even the average thunderstorm that takes out a culvert, tracking that data.
The action that's in here that I have is develop a priority list and map of community identified properties that have been damaged repetitively but are not on the FEMA repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss list used for buyout conservation.
Okay, because I'm suggesting is a little, I don't know how you'd require it necessarily, but what I'm thinking about is before that even some kind of, the town's actually keeping that information, tracking it, not only the damage, but the hours, materials, time, all that good stuff, so.
Yeah, it's not in here. We would want to probably see some language around that.
Chris, would they do that through the online bridge and culvert inventory tool?
What's that, Dave?
Would they do that through the online bridge and culvert inventory tool?
You certainly could on that particular piece of infrastructure, on this particular piece of infrastructure, yeah, and you could add pictures and other things.
Sounds like you need an outage management system.
The trick
The
is,
other
I mean, they have a lot of information, but oftentimes it's hard to get it off of the dash of the dump trucks and into the, some kind of town record.
What's actually very helpful, at least from the road and bridge perspective, is with AOT and the way that they have been surveying damage for they pretty much every time there's a big storm that does damage, they will go out now and assist in validating the cost of that. And we actually did that for the July 17th storm. They went out and they validated that there was $600,000 in damage in Windham County, and that was pretty much it statewide. That helps us determine whether we should pursue our disaster declaration, but it also helps because that data lives at AOT forever. Okay, so
Mike, this is something we could bring up when we talk with Joe next week.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Are there any other questions, thoughts, comments on prioritization before we go back to our little dark holes where we're only staring at a computer screen forever and ever doing prioritization?
The only thing that I would say is Ben's comment on what if it doesn't raise up here, but it would be helpful there. I mean, I've been just I put things in the notes to speak to that to help trigger. And I assume that's what everyone else's notes or comments, just to point that out. Everyone's shaking their head yes, so.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask, are folks using the spreadsheet that I sent out that has like the drop downs for, high, medium, low for each of those categories, and then the following column is a notes column, so you can capture that there?
That's what I used.
Great, because the next agenda item, I'm going to talk about cap drafting guidance, and hopefully it will be somewhat easy to kind of transfer from the spreadsheet into the actual Word document. So it's not like you're rewriting everything.
The drop downs only went halfway down. I think we had too many actions.
Sorry. Working quickly on that one.
Well, that sounds like a good transition. Oh, sorry, Erica.
Well, we want to set a deadline for submitting our spreadsheets to Say Marion for next week's meeting, so that we have access to them to look at, like Thursday morning.
I was just going to say, hopefully it's after Wednesday because we're meeting Tuesday and Wednesday. So.
Yeah, I think if I put it in the chat, but I think Erica, we talked about this, but it may make sense next week because we do need to start thinking about what we want to review with Kaya. So I think maybe a two-part. One, if you all want to send me what you have, but on Thursday, I can compile that into one place where we can have all the highs and the mediums and the lows listed out, and we can see those all together. But it may be worth looking broadly at what we have for highs, and then hearing from the pathway groups. Was there anything that came out as a medium or low priority that you all want to elevate up? And perhaps in your spreadsheet, just highlight that. I don't actually have a column for that, but highlight it or indicate it in some way so we can see that as a whole. So we'll want to think about, as a subcommittee, does this look like a complete package of high priority actions or actions that you want to have in the body of the cap? And then secondly, which are those? And I think it may just be, one action per pathway, but what are those actions that would be best to go through the equity screen with Kaya that's either an action that's really, really well, perhaps built out, has those details to go through that equity screen, or maybe has a lot of equity questions or considerations that you're not able to, you want to think about with her. And also an action, thinking about an action that would sort of help you all feel prepared to apply this to your other action. So I think that's the ask for the pathway leads, is to think, or pathway, groups as you're working on this next week, to think about which action or one or two actions would be good to think about with Kaya.
Just some thoughts on how do we structure the meeting? Because I mean, if we get them to you on Wednesday, that means they'll be posted Thursday. I think there's a lot of actions. It may be hard for people to really expect everybody to reasonably go through them. Do you want us to just kind of like we've done in past meetings, like bring each bring a couple things that we have questions we want feedback on at the meeting, or do you actually want to just dive into each sheet? Or what? Help me, give me some guidance on that.
Co-chairs, I was thinking about the same thing, Chris, as I was thinking about the agenda for next week. I don't know whether each group could actually do, this matrix is so hard to look at collectively, whether you take the high priority actions or ones you want to move forward and you put those in a slide deck. And we kind of go through maybe slides and name the issues that you have, assuming it's not going to be 20 slides, it's going to be, 2 or 3 each. I don't know what you think of that.
I mean, or we can, when they're reordered, once they're all ranked, and we can filter them with the high ones on top. And when we've come to consensus within our task groups about which few should be really elevated, the ones that we feel strongly about, highlight them in blue or something. And those are the ones that we'll talk about, and make sure that they're highlighted when they go to Marion.
I'm okay with that, rather than extra work for the task leads, if they can be sorted and highlighted. And I agree that that's super hard, that matrix is so challenging to look at, but if we're only looking at a smaller subset, it's easier.
It's all right. Can you clarify, what are you highlighting blue? Ones that you want to go through the equity screen with Kaya with, or ones that you
high priority?
The ones that of the high priority ones, well, maybe I need some clarification. Are all the high priority ones that we have ranked as high priority going to go into the cap eventually, or is it like a subset of those?
all are going into the cap, including any medium or low that you think as a consensus, as a subcommittee come to? So like what we were just talking about with, data needs or something that may not rank out as high priority, but you think they're really important and need to be called out in the body cap. So those are the ones where I was saying highlight them if they're not high priority, and you as a task group think that the subcommittee needs to talk about and come to consensus on whether those get included in the cap as well. But yeah, all high priority actions will get in the cap. And that's where I'm not sure, like it may be more than just 20, because as we were going through it with pathway 3, I mean,
then maybe
a lot of stuff.
Best use of our time is to ask our task group folks to come with a summarization, or just to be able to speak, to summarize verbally the actions that have been now ranked high, and the ones that are mediums that really should be high ones now, because they'll be in the spreadsheet. We'll be able to see that they're high, but I think there may be some additional context that we can talk through verbally that would be helpful. What do folks think about that?
So just to repeat so we're doing our sheets. We're flagging the ones that are the highest priority. We're making them blue.
No, you're not. I was confusing us because I'm sometimes confused. You're just sending in your sheets, and they'll get filtered so that the high ones are on top. Come prepared to talk about, summarize the high ones and why they were ranked as high.
Okay. And
any that are medium that should be elevated to a high priority.
Medium or low.
Or low. Mm-hmm.
Those, I think, getting back to highlighting, those are the ones you could potentially highlight so that it's clear to me which ones need to be discussed. And I can easily, if it's only a couple from each subcommittee, like put them in a PowerPoint or something if we want to look at them on a bigger screen. So highlight the ones that are not high priority that you as a task group think should be included in the body of the cap, and be prepared to make a case for why.
And then you don't need to highlight, but be prepared to recommend which one or two makes sense for the equity screening with Kaya on the following week.
I can follow up with an email with instructions.
Crystal looks puzzled, so I just want to.
It's my natural look.
I think the email with instructions is actually a good idea.
Yes, happy to do that.
And then Chris said Wednesday. I had written down, Marion, that you said get it to me by Thursday.
Well, it sounds like you all are meeting on Wednesday, so I don't think you can get it to me on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Get it to me on Thursday. If what I'm thinking, they'll all be nicely ranked, it won't be too difficult to pull it all together. Get it to me on Thursday morning, and then I'll try and get it posted before Friday.
The other thing to add to the instruction list is I assume we're going to do some clarifying scrubbing of the actions. So,
What do you mean, Chris?
well, like what we talked about, removing redundancies, clearing up, improving
That should be
language.
done at the task group level.
Yeah.
And just documented.
Mhm.
Yeah, feel free to make changes to actions, document what you changed, consolidate more if you can.
Yeah.
Can I just say that I love the level of trust that we all have for our task groups to go off and do this work and respect the opinions of the full subcommittee and come back together. I think it's really great. So thank you all for your work in that.
I think it's very rare.
Apparently it is. And so I thought it was worth noting that I appreciate it very much that we all can rely on each other like that.
Kumbaya.
Okay, it sounds like we've gotten through our pathway piece here. So why don't we hand it over to Marianne to talk about some CAP drafting guidance.
Yes, so let me share my screen here. So we've been so focused talking about actions in our spreadsheet. Little reminder that we do also have sections of the CAP to write. So we've talked about this in previous meetings. I know there is a updated CAP outline with assignments on the website, and I can link to that once I've stopped sharing my screen here, or perhaps Jane could post it in the chat. In order to be as clear as possible about what's expected for writing the CAP, we've put together a guidance document for drafting that has really minute details such as what font size to use and what font to use and double spacing and how to title things, and then broader guidance around how to actually structure really the meat of the climate action plan, which is going to be that run through of pathways, strategies, and actions. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we were waiting to receive comments from that cross-cutting group of counselors due back yesterday, and we've incorporated those that we received. So we'll share this out with folks today. The intent for drafting is we also have a SharePoint site that folks can use to populate sections of the climate action plan, and we have it sort of preloaded with Word documents with the titles of the sections as they're assigned. Understanding that not everybody loves SharePoint and it doesn't work for everyone. You could also just, submit it, and we have guidance about how to title them. Submit it to me and we can upload it onto SharePoint. But for those that do use SharePoint, we have a SharePoint site that I think we are ready to share today on for compiling sections of the CAP. I'm not going to go through the specifics here about titles and heading and spacing and all of that, but it is in here. And again, this is really for selfishly for me, so that when we're actually compiling the document together, everything's in roughly the same format, so it's easier to compile, but also for the Climate Council and subcommittees, as you're reviewing draft sections of the Climate Action Plan, it will be in the same format, so it's easier for you to review and to provide comment either at the council meetings or written comment. What I do want to do, though, is actually go through the pathway and strategy and action sections for you all to talk about what we're thinking in terms of how that's written into the CAP and if that outlines with what we've discussed with you all thus far. And then we can pull up the assignments document as well to remind folks of what you all volunteered for. So if you recall the CAP outline, sorry, I don't have it up in front of us, but again, the meat of the section is there are pathways and strategies and actions broken up into 4 broad buckets in the climate action plan. You'll see those on the bullets here. Pathways for mitigation, pathways for sequestering and storing carbon, pathways for adaptation and building resilience in natural and working lands, and then pathways for adaptation and building resilience in the built environment. And we've actually moved pathways for sequestering and storing carbon at the bottom. And so each of these broad sections are going to have multiple pathways in there. I think for rural resilience and adaptation, almost all of your pathways will be in adaptation and resilience in the built environment. Whereas I think pathway 3 will actually be under pathways for mitigation because it's talking about mitigation for rural communities. So each of these sections is going to have multiple pathways and is going to have a framing of why, adaptation and resilience in the built environment is important when we think about climate change and climate change impacts. There will be about a page written for those framing sections, and we have folks assigned to those. Erica has graciously volunteered to help write that section. As we move past sort of the framing section for those four broad categories in the pathway section of the plan, we'll jump into the pathways. And as you all recall, all of your pathways and strategies will be in the body of the climate action plan. And then as we've been talking about, the high priority actions and then any that you choose to elevate that were medium or low will also be in the climate action plan. So you'll have a section that just has the pathway as your header, and then a paragraph explaining really why that pathway is important to meet the objectives of the climate action plan. I've included a couple of examples from other climate action plans for folks to reference. And I think the expectation, and this is something we'll want to talk about, is that pathway leads or folks who have volunteered to write sections of the plan will be able to write this paragraph to frame up the pathway. Again, we're not thinking it's going to be very broad and should be kind of written in basic language so that anyone picking up and reading the plan can understand why upgrades to our infrastructure is really important as we meet our climate change objectives and is important for adaptation and resilience in the built environment. We then get into strategies. So again, all strategies are going to be included in the climate action plan. So you'll have your pathway and the multiple strategies that you have under each pathway. And again, like pathways, you'll have maybe a paragraph explaining why it's important and how it gets us to the what of the pathway and for the climate action plan overall. And then really what's going to make up the bulk of this section are your actions, and those are going to be formatted in a table. And so what those tables are going to look like is trying to take each action, having an area for a broader expansion on that action. And we're assuming that many of your actions are sort of formatted as a sentence or two, but there's likely some additional information you'll want to include with that as you explain the action in the body of the plan. Some of that you may already be keeping or capturing in the notes of your spreadsheets, or it may come out in the equity discussions with Kaya in a couple of weeks, but there will be an area for you to include a paragraph about the action and then a section to really highlight either in bullets or in a narrative format each of the foundational criteria that you're using right now for prioritization. And so that's why it's really important to just, as you're going through this process, keep notes for yourself in that spreadsheet, and we'll be able to transfer those over to the Word document for the climate action plan. So it's broken down into those tables there. Right now we have actions are going to be grouped by the lead implementer, and then a section, there will be a line under the action for the timeline to implement, and that's going to come sort of after we do the equity screen. But I think there are columns in the spreadsheet right now for these categories, and so as you're thinking about and talking about the action, you could fill these in. We have the implementers sort of grouped in 5 buckets: legislative, state agency, nonprofit, and private sector. And Jane, I actually think this is something we wanted to ask this group about, is whether we should break out regional and municipal or keep them as one category of implementer. And I actually do want to hear folks' opinion on that. So I'm going to stop and ask if anybody has input on that one.
I think they need to be broken out. I mean, regional and municipal could go together, but they're not the same as the state, and they're not the same as, nonprofit or business. And they're very different from all those other entities.
Sorry, so are you saying that regional and municipal should be 2 separate categories to be listed?
I think it might be okay to list them together.
Oh, okay.
What do you think, Dave?
Well, I think municipalities have more authority to actually implement things than a regional planning commission or development corporation would, but I think we should certainly be there to help advise the municipalities. I didn't answer your question, but I think grouping them maybe still be okay.
I guess the question that I had was really, I know there will certainly be actions that will be sort of implemented. The lead implementer will be a municipality, will be implemented at a municipal level. There are certainly actions, I think, that are tied to regional planning commissions. So a differentiation between, actions that are implemented by the regional planning commission versus municipalities. But are there other actions that you all can think of that would be implemented at a regional level, either by some other regional body beyond RPCs?
I'll just say for ag and eco, there are so many regional examples beyond RPCs. Like conservation districts, watershed associations, those are all regional in my mind as well. And so I do think like our RPC is one concept of regional, but we shouldn't really be just highlighting RPCs in the space. And so, and in one way I could go become a splitter here, but I also feel like there's so much overlap between the capacity brought to bear at a regional level and municipal and vice versa, that in my mind, we would want them thinking about and looking if they're going to pull a section out that's most applicable to them. That's why, to my mind, those should stay together, which is why I put it like that. But I'll defer to this group, and especially RPC executive directors, of which there are 3 sitting on this meeting, feel very strongly that it should be separate. Happy to consider that.
I think leaving it together is fine for now, and then we'll see how it looks maybe afterwards.
I agree. I think it makes sense to leave them together. I see watershed groups though, Jane, as being under the nonprofit because they are nonprofits. So I think, but I think leaving together makes sense because municipalities do have authority to act in ways that regional planning commissions don't. But in many of the associated actions where they are going to be taking a lead, there will be support primarily by RPCs and possibly by other organizations, depending upon the topic. So it makes sense to keep them together.
Yeah.
I defer to the wisdom in the room.
Well, I think we all agree, so it's awesome, right?
Great.
I think this is Jane's point too. It'd be helpful to look through the actions. I mean, I presume there's going to be how are we going to ensure there's the capacity to do this? And if you can look through and say all these actions need, regional or local capacity, I think that helps make an argument.
Yep. Yeah, I think this will become also more clear as we move through the actions and into implementation as well. All right, so I'll show you all actually what the table looks like. And it looks like a lot of text, but it's fairly clear, hopefully, as I just laid it out. You'll have your action here, so you could have your action sentence, or if you want to expand on it further based on discussions you've had. Timeline to implement, I didn't go through the implementation timelines, but it's 0 to 6 months, 6 months to 1 year, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 4 years, and then 4 years and beyond. And using the 4 years roughly because that's the cap update timeline. And then knowing that these will be bigger, but we want to be able to actually see and speak to each of the criteria that you all used for prioritization in the body of the cap. We went back and forth about whether this is sort of a consolidated paragraph talking about the criteria and leaving that up to the judgment of the subcommittees. But I think we do want to make sure that for each action that we're prioritizing as a high impact, we speak, or high priority, we speak to the impact, we speak to the conversation around equity, speak to cost effectiveness, and speak to co-benefits. And then as we've talked about, technical feasibility is going to be a basic yes or no, so we don't expect needing any additional words there. And as I said, we're going to look at trying to group these by what you're listing for lead implementers so that if folks are looking at the plan, they can see, okay, under this particular strategy, under this pathway, if we're looking at things that regional or RPCs or municipalities or regional organizations should implement, all of those actions will be sort of in one section and you can look at them that way. I think, as folks have said, we'll need to be clear that by the way that they're listed, it's not any sort of prioritization beyond just grouping as high or medium or low priority actions, but that we want to make sure that they're grouped by implementer because that will be most useful for the stakeholders using this plan.
Hey, Marion.
Yes.
When I see this table, I'm not sure how it's gonna get plopped into the cap. And in relation to the strategy that the action is associated to?
So these,
If you
this,
have that open, if you want to switch view, Marion, and show the cap outline.
sure. Do you want to show it?
Yeah, I have it open right now from dropping the link in.
Yeah, so it's perhaps a little hard to visualize when we only have the action table, but picture an action table for each strategy. So you're sort of going to have,
Exactly.
you have your pathway. Under each pathway, there are going to be multiple strategies. Under each strategy, there's going to be an action table.
Okay, all right. So the actions under each strategy will be organized by implementer.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So it's not like the whole
Because
list.
a strategy could have multiple actions that are taken on by different implementers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So you're going to have multiple strategies by multiple implementers, different timelines per strategy, actions per strategy.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is going to be a lot. There's sort of a lot of layers there. But the bulk of it is going to be the actions, because that's where you're doing the prioritization. That's where you're really talking about, how are we actually implementing the strategy to reach that pathway.
And we should say just also in those action tables, like once the actions have been lifted up by your subcommittee to be finalized and advanced into the body of the plan, as Marion's suggesting with the outline, with the action table, you'll no longer see them as high or medium or low. So if you have advanced, medium, or low ones, those won't show as any differently. They'll be sorted the same way. People would have to go to the appendix where you would have all that comprehensive work that was done to actually know why they reviewed and ranked any differently than others. So they'll just appear as a priority action at this point.
Yep.
So I just want to underscore something.
And I put this up here just to make sure this is all in line with how you all remember volunteering.
I just want to underscore something for folks. How you should view the prioritization you're doing now is really kind of a first, is just to get them in order. We are going to need more detail in the notes section of that spreadsheet, because those spreadsheets are going to go to these cap drafters that are listed right here. And they have to be able to extrapolate information, write a paragraph on the action based on the notes that you have provided. So the way that we can make those cap drafters' job the easiest is if we can do a lot of that work up front and make sure our notes are as comprehensive and detailed as possible. And I also want to note that the timeline for submitting our section of the cap draft is our draft has to go to the council on November 2nd. That means, back it up a couple days, when you look at November 2nd, it's a Tuesday, I think, or something. October 29th is when we should really be submitting our section of the cap draft. So I just want to call that to attention, because as we're working to prioritize, our work is not done, because we need to make our drafters' job as easy as possible. And you need to make sure that your notes are as comprehensive and detailed as possible in that spreadsheet.
So our draft is
Just so you
due
know,
to be posted on November 2nd for the
Yeah,
council review on November 9th.
yeah.
So a little bit more time than,
Okay, so, okay, good.
but
Good, thank
our
you,
last,
Kristen.
our last committee meeting prior to that posting is October 29th.
Right. That will be the last meeting for you all to resolve
Okay.
any. So that will be the last meeting for you all to review your section. Yeah. Because it'll all come together in that one.
We'll have to be relatively final by then.
Mhm.
Comprehensive but concise, promise.
Yes.
Yeah, it's going to be a pretty long list. I don't know if there's some discussion about the climate council itself lifting even of these, in the different sequestration, resilience, and mitigation, some top ideas, because I don't know, I guess that's a rabbit hole, but maybe we shouldn't go down to. But
Well,
It
we
may
may
be
want to
overwhelming.
have a discussion about how we want to order our high priority items.
Yeah.
I really do want to encourage that that you really do lean into prioritization. I have so much sun in my face, which is just like actually a reminder that I should be outside and not on my desk. But the prioritization is intended to lift up and whittle out actions. And so I know that everybody wants all the actions to keep moving, but please use the prioritization and see where we get. And know that the rest of those actions won't be lost. They'll be there for other people to pick up outside of this plan, as well as us to further work on in future iterations of the climate action plan.
And go ahead, Chris.
Well, no, I was just making a joke. What's the decision on Oxford comma? Yes, no?
Yes, use it.
No, don't use it.
Use it.
I'm in the Catherine camp, but Marion already overruled me. She has the power I have here, Catherine.
I have this argument with my regional plan committee all the time.
We need one stance for the cap, and we're using it.
It could be one of the most controversial decisions ever made by the Climate Council.
We may have to dedicate a whole meeting to it. Chris, are you ready?
Think about all that ink you're wasting. Oh my God.
Just following up on what Jane said about the prioritization, because I think this was clear working with Pathway 3. You know, as we've talked about, the definitions are not perfect, but it is what the council adopted, and we should be able to show how we came to a high, medium, or low overall prioritization. And if you're working through it and you get to a point where, you know, because of what's been ranked for cost effectiveness and how it's come out in terms of impact and co-benefits, and it's a medium or a low, I would caution you and then going back and saying, oh no, but we wanted it as a high. What do we need to change in order to make it a high? Because I know that's going to be something that folks want to look at, but we have these, you know, definitions, and they've been reviewed by the council so that we can have a prioritization and not have all of our actions coming out as high, because that would be a very long list. So
if you want to elevate something, we'll elevate it, retaining the actual prioritization score, but we'll elevate it for other reasons that are apparent.
Yep, right. Okay, right. So that is all I have. Jane, I think we'll share the cap drafting guidance today with the SharePoint side, although I have to work with IT on that, but at least share the cap drafting guidance with subcommittees and drafters today, so we can get that out for folks. As you're thinking about doing the prioritization, you can have that in front of you as well.
So anything else on cap drafting guidance?
I can't work with Chris Campany. I can't do it.
I'm not sure how I got on the drafting list, but I guess that's another topic for another conversation. I'm not actually a member of the committee or anything, so.
You said you wanted to help support drafting of the land use work, and so I put you related to the pathways on that, but and that's how when you were in the meeting that day and we put you there. Happy to take you off, but that was why you were there. Those are the pathways around land use.
Catherine, you're lit up. What do you think?
What was that?
You were lit up. Your box lit up after that. Didn't know if you're going to say anything.
Oh no, it was probably just a bird.
Committed anywhere else for cap drafting?
What's that?
Are you committed anywhere else for cap drafting?
No, not yet.
Your expertise is wanted here, sir.
There you go.
Okay.
We pulled directly from the chat from that meeting when folks were volunteering, so that's how you ended up there.
It's a moment of weakness, Chris.
Yeah.
And Chris, if you don't want to work with me too, I understand. It's okay. No,
I'm happy to work with you. It's more the time issues.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for the time that you are dedicating to helping to lift up our work through the drafting process. We really appreciate it. Are there any more questions on the guidance for the cap drafting?
Can we get a Northwest Regional Planning Commission priority drop down, for implementers?
We are hiring. Should have seen that. In anticipation.
I almost replied to your email. Don't get any of my people. Less one too many people to climate.
Staff lost to climate change.
So next we have on the agenda, the cross-cutting themes group update, and we are running a little behind. But we don't want to shortchange this agenda item. So is this Chris or Marion or Jane who's going to be doing this? Oh, Jane, I see you're on our agenda.
Yeah, this can be brief, but also happy to answer questions. If y'all all remember, there was an intent to engage counselors directly in the drafting of the climate action plan and really thinking through how we best represent and start to break down the silos of the respective subcommittees to pull together a cumulative plan. There's a representative from each subcommittee who is now meeting, and we've had 2 meetings, and Catherine is your official representative, and Chris sat in for her last week, which was actually Chris Cochran really appropriate too, because the first meeting really focused on looking at and considering the outline, as well as focusing in on what those cross-cutting ideas and themes were. And in order to further support that conversation, we decided to look specifically at land use, which is the most cross-cutting theme that we're seeing out of all the subcommittees. And so there was some groundwork done between the first and second meeting around looking at the specific actions from each of the subcommittees related to land use, and starting to think about where there might be conflict, and then ultimately how to best represent it in the climate action plan. The meeting last week really dove in deep around land use, and then around more broadly how and where to reflect cross-cutting ideas and themes in the body of the climate action plan, and then ultimately what those will be. Based on what I heard, there was like 2 camps at that meeting, essentially about how to deal with it, 2 divergent camps. And Marion and I reflected on the meeting after and put forward an idea different than both of those camps, but hopefully reflective of the conversation and really trying to get at everything. And it revised the climate action plan outline to have in the body, there's essentially 3 components of the climate action plan: an introduction section, the body of where the action is going, your pathway, strategies, and action, and then an implementation section. And it was a challenge thinking about how and where to synthesize the cross-cutting nature of cross-cutting policies and ideas. And so reflective that we don't want to be duplicative and restating the same actions all the time, and also trying to keep it in the body of where action is in the plan. We created a new pathway area that now has mitigation pathways, resilience coming after mitigation rather than sequestration, so that we can really build that connection between mitigation and resilience and adaptation all more seamlessly. And then at the bottom, having cross-cutting pathways, of which land use is the most obvious one, specific around compact settlement development, and pulling those actions and strategies out of the specific subcommittees, or I shouldn't say subcommittees anymore, because once you get into the climate action plan, there's not really subcommittees. It's around these buckets of work. Pulling those out, putting them all at the bottom, and then thinking about how in those framing sections, you'll want to speak to land use is key to resilience in the built environment. That idea, it transcends our recommendations and is spoken to in detail around the actions in the cross-cutting section. So your pathway 4 will no longer be in the resilience body of work, but it'll be in that cross-cutting issue, as so will the work in ag and eco that speaks to that, as well as the transportation actions that speak to land use. So that's sort of like the revised CAP outline that we shared based on that conversation. And we still are yet to sort of highlight all the other cross-cutting themes that likely have a nexus like that also to go under there. There's a handful that I can think of now. Electrification is one that keeps coming up, and education. And then we also have a section under there around personal action, like to how an individual wants to see themselves in the climate action plan and think about how they can take action to advance. They can look at that section. So that revised outline that I put the link in the chat for will be reflective of that revision based on that discussion. And the next time that group comes together, hopefully we'll reach consensus around what further cross-cutting pathways go under there, as well as pick lead counselors to draft some of the sections that are being led by counselors, like the letter from the council that'll go into the climate action plan, and ultimately it'll take a staff member or council member to draft the letter from the governor, those kinds of components. So that's what we've been working on. I think it was kind of messy last time, but I hope, I'd be curious what Chris, you specifically think about how we put forward the revisions to the cap.
I think it's great. I'm done. I'm ready to get to work.
Good. Phew. Go ahead, Bronwyn.
But a couple things, and your cross-cutting though, I don't, broken record again, but capacity, workforce, budget, I think are things that unresolved.
Yeah. We have those there too, already in the cap outline, like highlighted as cross-cutting themes, but we're also hearing loud and clear from other subcommittees, like weatherization in particular is one example that keeps coming up, where they want to keep workforce with them as a stepwise action, because it's so integral to that one specific action. So it's good that some of these are going to be hard, like where we want to pull them all together and speak succinctly about workforce specifically, but also keep them within the relative to the actual action that we're trying to achieve on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it could be just a paragraph that's going to take a lot of money and resources to get this done. Maybe up to front.
That is one way we've talked about it, is just like a paragraph on workforce, a paragraph on education, say that it shows up in a lot of different places. And, like a year from now, when we actually make the plan look nice, you could have little icons if it's like whatever theme it is, and it references back to that paragraph, but not actually pulling those out separately, because then you just lose the whole point of that strategy.
We're going to make the plan look nice. We just met on this week, didn't we?
It will be less than a year from now. It won't be December 1st.
Too many
It
comments.
won't be December 1st is stapled together. Plan. Go ahead, Bronwyn.
I love icons. Thumbs up on icons.
Yeah.
Apologies, that was a lot, and I'm not sure I digested it. And if it's not appropriate for this meeting, I can relive, because these are recorded, right? So I can go back and listen again and digest all that again. But maybe just if it's a quick clarification. So the cross-cutting, the new section on cross-cutting, is it that we will be taking actions out of existing pathways and moving them to a new section? Or will it just be that
would get moved?
The entire pathway would get moved?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what your boss advocated for.
Well, yeah, well, so I know, so that's why I am very hesitant I'm not complaining. I was advocating for this as well. It's just at this point in the game, I'm just trying to envision how it impacts. I'm just trying to envision how it impacts what we say in those pathways and in those actions around the impact, around the co-benefits. So I'm just trying to think now, because we were drafting this up as though it was going to be, this is just it. It's going to be in the resiliency pathway. That's just the end of the game. But now that it's shifting, I'm just trying to envision how it's going to change what we write.
Marion and I think you still go through your own prioritization, and the actions that are the highest priority are the ones that will then be assimilated under this pathway that's trying to address the high priority actions that we're all speaking to a similar pathway in other subcommittees. So Ag and Eco has a very similar pathway around compact settlement. And so, or I should say they more have actions, not a pathway. So they need to review those, make sure those are high priority based on their process, and then would assimilate them into your the work under this cross-cutting pathway. And I think some of that clarity still needs to be formed to ensure people have consensus around how we're now showing it in the climate action plan. And we can always, I think that it makes most sense to keep it in the body, which I agree, because that's where you're looking for action, and have implementation speak to more on the funding and policy side and legislative action, that kind of work. But hopefully we can still bring a little bit more clarity about how we roll it all up and who's going to do that. But my assumption is, like for land use, the cross-cutting pathway, that would, because the pathway was developed by Rural Resilience, and we're almost feeding in the actions from transportation and ag and eco, that it would still be your pathway. It's just showing as a cross-cutting theme, and we're going to tie it back to the other components of the work.
Okay. Thank you for helping me out with that.
And just so I would assume we would take the lead on it and then just get feedback from those other committees, making sure that everything's addressed. I
think that's what we'll have to talk about with the group
Yeah.
the next time we meet, but
Okay.
that would be my preference.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other thoughts on the cross-cutting themes group update? It sounds kind of like a choose your adventure book. Eventually you'll get to all the stories. You just can get to it in different orders. All right. So next on our agenda is next steps. I think we've talked a lot about that. Is there anybody that has any questions about what's next, besides Marion sending out an email with what we all think we agreed to? All right. No questions about next steps. So Erica, over to you.
Any public comment at this time? None. If we were everybody out, including myself. Any final closing thoughts or comments that subcommittee members want to leave us with? Found 6 minutes of sound time, get some sunshine. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.